everybody to Invent at IIT 2020. I'm very happy to have you all here with us. This has been a very interesting journey for us to bring together the entrepreneurs who are the founders, co-founders of small companies starting up right now, to continue in the tradition of IITians who are the fourth largest creator of unicorns in the world. Of course, starting from stalwarts like Sun Microsystems, Juniper Networks, and other organizations like Palo Alto Networks, Nutanix, Cohesity, most recently Zscaler. Also growing up very much in India, very popular companies like Flipkart, Snapdeal, ShopClues, Ola, Zomato, Quikr, Inmobi. The list is extremely long. My name is Animesh Pathak, and I am the chair of Invent. I am extremely happy to welcome all of you for 2 days of spotlights, showcases, and conversations. Spotlights will be 2 sessions held in US time and 1 session held in India time over today and tomorrow. In the first session today, we will have 16 IITian-founded startups pitching their ideas to a panel of experts whom we are calling Funda Men and Funda Women. In the evening, which will be IST time, noon to 2 o'clock, we'll have 10 startups in our India Spotlight session. Tomorrow morning, we start with Mohit Aaron and Carl Eschenbach in a fireside chat. Mohit and Carl are extremely prominent individuals who need no introduction, but Mohit is from Cohesity and Carl is from Sequoia Capital. Then Startup Spotlight number 2. Tomorrow, we'll have 9 more startups conversing about their pitches. Now, in terms of IIT 2020 Invent, we've gone through a very interesting story. I'm happy to share with you that we have had 450 startups who applied, registered, gave us the information. We had a conversation about what information they have, out of which ultimately, after multiple rounds of evaluation, 33 total were selected. I'm also very happy to report that these startups came from 15 different IITs, which shows how the spirit of innovation is not just deep, but also very broad. We have more than 30 VCs and angels available with us to talk about their experiences, to give us some feedback. In fact, the first panel of those experts, which are going to kick us off right now, is already with us. I'm seeing my peers having joined me already. Let me quickly introduce our first main moderator, and that is Ashu Garg. Ashu Garg is an IITian, and he's from IIT Delhi, got his MBA from IIM Bangalore, where he received the President's Gold Medal. Ashu has a long and storied career in multiple organizations where he has worked for Microsoft, handling online advertising. He has worked in McKinsey & Co., helping technology companies scale their go-to-market efforts. He also is an entrepreneur, having founded TringTring.com, one of the first search engines in Asia. With his extensive background, he has led seed investments in HipDot, Nextforce Technologies, Otter.ai. He also serves on the boards of Anvil Logic, Arise, Skyflow, Turing, among many, many others. He also has led investments in multiple companies and has overseen multiple successful exits. So Ashu, of course, is a general partner at Foundation Capital. With that said, Ashu, how about you take over?
Thank you very much, and I'm glad I got in. Literally, as you were introducing me, I got thrown off the platform. I was like, okay, this is going to be a fun conference. But happy to be here, folks. As Animesh said, I'm a general partner at Foundation Capital. We're an early stage seed and Series A firm that invests across enterprise, fintech, and frontier tech companies. I lead the enterprise investing efforts at Foundation. And I've been very fortunate to have invested in at least a dozen companies that have been founded by IITians, including Cohesity, Eightfold, and Turing. I have with me, folks who are both friends and fellow investors. I want to start off by introducing Ashmeet. Ashmeet has been one of my mentors for many years, so it's great to be on a panel here with him. He's one of the first venture capitalists I met more than a dozen years ago. He is the founder and chief engineer of Engineering Capital. He's a very seasoned operator who built ESX Server, which was VMware's flagship product. He founded his own startup and has now been a VC for more than 15 years. He was the first investor in Menlo Security, vFunction, and Robust Intelligence. Welcome to the panel, Ashmeet.
Thank you, Ashu. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you for joining us. The other panelist for us is Kanu. Kanu Gulati is the principal at Khosla Ventures. She's focused on investments in machine learning and AI-enabled applications and autonomous systems. She was a founding employee at OmniSci, a GPU-accelerated data analytics solution, a scientist and engineer at Intel, Cadence, and multiple startups. She has led Khosla Ventures' recent investments in Wave 1, Corbett, and Analog Inference. Kanu, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
And then we have with us a very special guest all the way from London. So Reshma is the founder of SeedCamp and really pioneered early stage investing in Europe going back 15 years. Built over the last 13 years, SeedCamp, the organization she founded, is the leading seed firm in Europe. You know, many people have called it the YC of Europe. SeedCamp has invested in more than 350 companies, including TransferWise, UiPath, Revolut, and Hopin, you know, one of the leading video conference platforms. Reshma, thank you for joining us. I know it's late in the day for you.
Oh, it's an honor. I was just kind of dealing with the kids and then ran in here. So,
you know, maybe we can kick this off by having each one of you talk a little bit about your areas of interest. Ashmeet, maybe do you want to kick that off?
Thanks, Ashu. I think it may be obvious from the name of my firm that I focus on companies that have deep technical insights. The way I define that is companies that are taking technical risk in addition to market risk. I only do software companies, very early stage, where they are solving some problem which is not obvious what the solution would be to a good engineer. That's what I look for.
So lots of technical risk and great engineers.
That's the magic formula.
Reshma, maybe you can talk about sort of your perspective. What areas do you focus on?
it's really funny, and Ashmeet and I've met a few years ago, and we as we got to talking, we said we're very different, right? And I think it's the beauty of sort of venture capital done in different ways. We believe we focus very early stage, and we also are focused on software, internet, anything kind of that is capital efficient. We're very European focused as well, but our view is we are quite generalist, extremely horizontal, and we also do quite a high volume of investing. So we are trying to build sort of a 100 company portfolio per vintage, per fund. And we invest, roughly in, every 10 days we make a new investment, and we do cover, our death rate is high. And so I think it's different, right? And it clearly we have a model that works as well. But anything that we think, our 100, 500K as part of a 2 million round maximum, at the stage we focus at, anything that'll move the needle, B2C, B2B, SaaS enterprise, kind of everything.
Well, it leads to a lot of interesting questions on what you look for in founders, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Maybe Kanu, you can talk about, your areas of interest, and I can wrap up that and we can dive deeper into founders.
Yes, absolutely. So Khosla Ventures is seeking early, bold, and impactful investment opportunities across all sectors. We think of we want to invest in large spaces, think spaces that affect the GDP of a country, and where technology usually creates leverage. But we're also excited about, where the unfair advantage can be the team, a new business model, or a unique business insight. I spend time on enterprise-facing applications based on, say, recent advances in machine learning, computer vision, deep learning, natural language processing. I realize those are a lot of buzzwords, but those are the areas I enjoy and spend time in. I also look at robotics and autonomous systems. So I think of them as perception stack plus some control logic and AI. So yeah, those are generally the areas of interest for me.
That's great. So I think we have a very broad set of interests. You know, my approach tends to be closer to, I think, the way Ashmeet described it. I largely, I would say 2 out of 3 the founders I've invested in are IITians. I tend to look for very deeply technical projects where founders have a technical insight on why something can be done today that couldn't be done or wasn't casually obvious to other folks. But given that, I'll invest across applications all the way to security and infrastructure, mostly because I don't know enough about any one of those things to be an expert on any one of those spaces. And maybe, given that we all invest in such different areas, it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about what we look for in founders. What is the common theme across our investments? I was wondering, Reshma, maybe you can kick that off and talk about what do you look for in your founders?
Sure, and I will add a European lens to it, just because I do think Europe, we've a chip on our shoulder in Europe here, because we do sort of get ignored in a way of US, China, India obviously as well, and it's like, okay,
where does Europe fit in that? Yeah,
where is that? So I think that's informed, kind of informed us over the 13 years. Is one of the key criteria for us is that the founders here do want to go global, to be honest. So we are really looking at world-beating world-beating companies as such, and it's not a given, because the market is large enough to serve in itself, and yet fragmented and challenging. If you do start here, it takes you a while to sort of expand here. So we do look at it very differently, is to say, actually, we want to back European founders that want to go to, I think US is often the first market, even if you start in France or Germany, because it's a homogenous English speaking, it often is the next market before you even go into Spain or Netherlands as such. So I think a very global outlook. 2 is, given sort of we've been doing this for a while as well, I think it takes a special kind of grit and perseverance and hustle again to sort of rise through. So I think that's a massive quality. And all I can say to that, because I get founders going, well, what is that? What is that? What is that? Is I can just say it's competitive and it's comparative. It is relative, sort of what our judgment is when we look out for founders with those kinds of qualities. And again, to contextualize, look, we're writing 100K, 500K checks. So really that is a lot of what to go on. And the last, probably more quantitative, especially for I think the group audience today, is we do look a lot at, where have you studied? What have you built? Where it sort of, even if you're very young coming out of universities, had you been doing a PhD project, or what sort of validation is there to your background? Because beyond that, there is no product market fit yet for what we look at. There's no traction, no, none of that. So those are really we have to really very much look at founder qualities, and that's what, those are the qualitative and quantitative things we tend to look at.
Kanu, do you want to talk a little bit about what you look for in founders?
Yeah, there is a Steve Jobs quote I really like, which talks about the most powerful person in the world is a storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation to come. We think that founders basically have to be excellent storytellers. They have to be able to recruit and sell, land contracts and partnerships, bring in follow-on funding, all with limited resources of a startup. And being able to narrate a story of their vision is key. And it can, regardless of the stage, given the stage, it's equally important that they can articulate which risks need to be retired and in what order to deliver on that vision. We are open whether those risks are in technology or recruiting or business models or sales motions. But for us to understand how the entrepreneur thinks about the big vision and ordering those risks, that becomes key. Beyond that, we don't have any given categories or any other classifiers.
Got it. Now I understand, Kanu, why you never end up investing in my projects, because my partners tell me that I specialize in entrepreneurs that are bad storytellers.
That's completely fair. I've been
very deeply technical founders. And that's one of the challenges when you look for very technical founders. Very significant number of them are immigrants. for whom English isn't their first language. And so storytelling doesn't necessarily come naturally to them. So only half kidding. But, when I think about the founders, I look for, the first thing I look for, I don't know what the best way to put it is, I look for a chip on their shoulder. Like I look for what is their motivation? Why are they going to do something which in mathematical terms is an NPV negative project? Every startup at the founding stage is NPV negative. Like there's no rational reason to ever do a startup. And so the question I ask myself is, why is this person doing something that is irrational? And what motivates them? And what will motivate them through the inevitable ups and downs of a startup? I mean, that's one of the questions I sort of really focus on. And then I look for people who will prioritize that startup over everything in their lives. The persistence and grit that comes. I think those are, for me, the two things I value a lot. But I'm curious, Ashmeet, you've done this for a very long time. What do you look for in your founders?
Ashu, founders are such an important part of the decision that we make, but more importantly, of the outcome that occurs in a company. So first, let's just recognize that it really is the founders who determine the success of a startup. And my position is the exact opposite of Warren Buffett's position as an investor. Warren Buffett says when a great founder meets a bad market, the market wins. In a startup, I don't think that rule is true. I think in a startup, you have a lot more degrees of freedom, especially at the very early stages. And great founders really do create markets and can create amazing differences. So, what would be Apple without Steve Jobs, or what would be Oracle without Larry Ellison, or Microsoft without Bill Gates, or Facebook without Mark Zuckerberg, et cetera, to take some IIT examples. What would be Nutanix without Dheeraj, et cetera. So, it is a very important element. Let's first recognize that. Second, it's a subjective decision. As Reshma said, when at this stage, there's very little data to go on. So it is subjective, and that's why we make so many mistakes. Most VC investments have a negative NPV, as you said, as you recognized. In fact, most startups have a negative NPV. So it's very subjective. That's why it's so error prone. And what I focus on are really the contradictions that make a founder special. So what do I mean by contradictions that make a founder special? Is this a person who has achieved something with very little? That's a contradiction. Usually it takes resources to accomplish something. Immigrants have often gone through a lot of difficulty and have faced unusual odds. That's a contradiction. So that's why you see a high correlation between immigrants and startups. But you don't have to be an immigrant. Mark Zuckerberg was not an immigrant. Steve Jobs was not an immigrant. Bill Gates was not an immigrant. So what are the other contradictions I look for? In terms of specific attributes, do they have persistence without being obstinate? That's a very subtle and nuanced difference. Is this someone who is going to look at the market with a flexible learning growth mindset while having the persistence and grit to go against the grain and keep a contrarian view, because every startup is contrarian. So these are the subjective elements that make up great founders. And of course, the global mindset, the ability to be a great storyteller, to have the deep motivation, whether it comes from a chip on their shoulder or some unnatural ambition, which the three of you recognized, those are all assets that go into making a great founder.
That's super helpful. This is a topic on what we look for in founders. We could probably spend the hour on. And so if we have time, we may want to come back to it in the end. But I wanted to keep going, maybe talk a little bit about the environment. When we were prepping for this panel, one of the topics that came up consistently is this has been such a tumultuous year with lots of extremes. And so lots of folks had questions on what's the environment. And I was hoping, Reshma, maybe you could kick that off with your perspective on the environment, in particular about valuations, but also more broadly. We'd love to get a European lens on the environment for all, startups.
Yeah, no, and what's been fascinating here is, again, always sort of playing catch up. 2020 was fascinating because towards kind of mid 2019 and early this year, we've had a flood of capital coming in from the US. Sequoia setting up with a lot of great fanfare, kind of their European presence, Bessemer Ventures shipping, one of my compatriots from University of Pennsylvania here as well to set up the London office. Benchmark's just about to make another investment here in a French company. So yeah, so I think that's what, that's amazingly enough, that's what we've been presented with in the beginning, and it's sort of carried through. And what I'll say is, it's really because I would say our portfolio, but we see it across sort of venture here is, again, European companies had to do a lot with little. Back to Shmit's point about sort of those who can show that persistence and grit. And I think that's been well received, to how much sort of progress they've been able to make. And now, because then it was as easy to invest via Zoom, whether that was around Sand Hill Road or Boston or London or Romania. There's been nothing sort of stopping our companies from attracting that kind of capital. So, I mean, it's been incredible. Like, valuations are on a tear. And it's for sure, there's the winners and losers. I mean, it's been very much the companies in enterprise, SaaS, digital and pushing kind of the envelope on digitization. We just haven't had exposure really to travel and hospitality. So we're not as much of an investor in those spaces. And so, it's almost too competitive, frankly, here, even at the early stages. And a lot of the kind of quantitative support from governments, Germany sort of saying, we want to protect our startup nation, and UK saying the same, and so forth. There's been incredible amounts of capital, and I'll say particularly like comms infrastructure. I was just, it's the era of enterprise, and the era of the knowledge workers we know. And I think the biggest trend we see is all about sort of tools on collaboration, communications, and we see it with our, Hopin as the poster child for 2020.
Thank you. That's very helpful perspective. Kanu, Khosla Ventures invests across stages and across, sort of sectors. So would love to get your perspective on valuations in particular, and sort of the environment more broadly.
Yes. Obviously the pandemic is terrible for all sorts of reasons, and it's harder in some ways to show the breakout, right? But then when entrepreneurs do show breakout and show the persistence, like Reshma mentioned, the market rewards them. There's also a set of verticals that are seeing acceleration because of the pandemic. These are, think autonomous systems and warehouses and manufacturing and e-commerce, new solutions around supply chain, definitely online collaboration, future of work, remote learning, areas such as esports, not to mention healthcare, like new ways of doing diagnosis and lab services, others. So these are largely areas where we think innovation, new solutions, etc., will likely stay on beyond, like in a post-pandemic world, whether due to an economic argument or a quality of experience or just customer delight. And these markets, so I think the market valuations are reflecting that sentiment, that these solutions will just stay on longer. It's not just a COVID, COVID time solution. That they just should exist because of the economic argument. That's how we think about this space.
Got it. That's super helpful. Shmit, maybe I wanted to take a slightly different take on what's changed in the environment. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, pre-COVID and post-COVID, especially the earliest stages where it's so much of a bet on the founder, as you articulated.
Yeah, so, history will obviously remember 2020 as the year of COVID, which has been a great tragedy around the world. Arguably, one of the greatest tragedies of the decade, perhaps of the century, that we are going to see. But the silver lining is that it has been an amazing opportunity for startups. This great tragedy has created great disruption. And whenever there's disruption, there's great opportunity. And that is why we are seeing what I describe as rational exuberance in the startup world in valuations. Why are valuations so high in the startup world? Because we are seeing at the tail end, companies like Salesforce buy Slack for 27 times forward revenues. which are seemingly absurdly high multiples. But all the way at the very startup stage, which is the stage that most of us here focus on, is that it has created an enormous wealth of opportunities. Kanu talked about the opportunity in warehouses. If you read the St. Louis Fed Beige Book report, that actually focused specifically on that this week. And they talked about the shortage of warehouse workers in America. And what does that mean for robotics? What does that mean for logistics? What does that mean for supply chain? Where opportunities where startups can go in and benefit? More broadly, because software is such an incredible leverage in allowing you to change how everything in life works. I think that's a tremendous opportunity for startups. And that's why we see this rational exuberance and a proliferation of startups around the world globally.
I mean, I think, and I think probably one of the areas sort of, in a way shocking, in a way, obviously a huge leap is, DeepMind's announcement around the advances sort of they've made in protein folding, right? And to think of a software company applying that and where's pharma been all this time, right? And so it's just to like double click on Ashmit's point, like what software is capable of doing is, when you see that, it's just like, wow, a biological revolution is upon us, right, for the next 100 years. So I mean, it's really exciting.
A biological revolution, a robotics revolution, a software revolution, an AI revolution. All of these revolutions are coming at the same time. So this is one of the best times ever to do a startup. It really is amazing.
I think both of you, I think what all three of you are saying really resonates. I mean, I think what the broader world outside tech, I think, has suddenly woken up and said, hey, tech markets are 10 times larger than we thought they were. I've been watching DocuSign where, one of the former sort of foundation portfolio entrepreneurs is the CEO, and looking at Dan Springer, and, everyone thought of DocuSign as this little thing that was going to help you sign documents, which is kind of what it is. But it's amazing that today DocuSign is a $50 billion company for signing documents. And I don't think public markets would have appreciated that even a year ago. I think one of the biggest, in a positive way, for us as investors, entrepreneurs, and people with a vested interest in the startup ecosystem, is that change in perception in public markets. And it's hard to say whether the exuberance is rational or irrational. I think it depends on the day. But the scale of the opportunity, I think, is so much larger than people had anticipated for all of the reasons that everyone talked about.
But actually, I'll help you feel better about DocuSign, and it's because, look, in Germany today, still, even in the UK, some of these legal documents, you pay 800 pounds or euros for a lawyer to sit there to literally read to you 15. So there you go. If I don't even pay that much for so you've got lots of potential for DocuSign, right?
Absolutely. Till a few months ago, you couldn't legally sign a document, a real estate transaction using DocuSign in California. That's changed literally in the last couple of months. So I think that's the other shift, which COVID has forced broader society at large to come to terms with the impact of technology. So many of the companies, we have someone who helps manage the Global 2000 relationships for us. And so many of those companies said for the first time, we had to deal with the fact that we'd let employees take corporate information home.
Right.
And we had no choice in COVID. But once the cat is out of the bag, there's no putting it back in. And so there are companies where they've never let employees have laptops. And for us sitting here in tech, that's kind of really that still happens. But I wouldn't name companies, not to pick on them, but huge companies were in that mindset. And so
I agree with you. These are creating new opportunities, like even in, not just in the US and like the, kind of a more technology leaning in country, even in Asia, there's, traditionally BPO services and contact centers, they could not take the corporate hardware home, take their laptops home. And increasingly companies are more comfortable letting that new business model or new working model just happen. And I think that'll just create so many more opportunities for startups to capture.
And those are very broad views. If you take a very narrow view, I mean, after all, this is the IIT conference and we are all engineers and, working deeply in technology. What we are also seeing right now is one of those rare inflection points when every layer of the stack is seeing technical innovations simultaneously. This is very rare. If you look at the computer industry over the last few decades, there was the era of the mainframes and the era of the PCs, and then we had the internet, et cetera, where in each of those spaces, there was tremendous innovation that occurred. But right now, for the first time, we are seeing chip companies revisit, should we have a von Neumann architecture? Is the Harvard architecture the right approach to build a chip? Of course not for AI chips. And that's why we are seeing chip startups. We are seeing all of the software layer being reinvented at the infrastructure level by the cloud giants. Then we are seeing this tremendous growth in middleware, the API economy, companies talking to each other, building hybrid cloud, et cetera. And then at the application layer, AI impacting every application that has ever been built before. I mean, it's inconceivable that you would build an application today and not leverage machine learning in some way in doing that. And all of this is happening driven simultaneously with all of the macro factors, work from home and COVID and all of the factors that we were talking about earlier. And that's why I do believe very strongly that this is a period of rational exuberance and one of the best times ever to do a startup.
Rachel, maybe you could take a European lens on some of the things we just talked about. Would love, you've been investing in Europe for as long as there's been venture in Europe. It's a relatively, for over the last 15 years, you've seen the European ecosystem evolve. I would love to get your perspective on some things we just talked about from sort of a time series perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think nodding and sort of to what has been said, and I mean, I think sort of compared to 10, 15 years ago, I mean, it was really rough here. Like, it was a desert. There's so many problems just across, and I think led by UK to a large extent. It's been a wonderful place to be the last decade or so. Starting with smaller success stories, and I think, again, I'm not an IIT alum, but following the brand over time as well. I think it's role models, right? And I think it's been that sort of layer of smaller success stories and layering on top of that. So, and the democratization of knowledge, right, about startups, because it was just so Valley centric. And I think it's just all spread across everywhere. So I think sort of that ambition, seeing those role models, having same access to knowledge. And now, I think what government's done actually across the European footprint has been pretty awesome. Harmonizing, especially financial services across, with passporting, has unleashed. I mean, it's made Europe, leapfrog, right, in terms of what's possible to do here, and hence we have so many global kind of success stories in fintech. So I think government led a lot, seeing everything shrink after the first .com bust. So that, and then I mean, capital's been the last to catch up, and it's really done that. And I say even more, especially in the last 4 years of the political situation in the US, Europe's benefited a lot as well in terms of that capital inflow. I think it's been seen, it's been this Switzerland broadly sort of neutral ground as such. And so it's attracted, fair bit of interest from US as well, and Asia as well to play here. So yeah, echo that. And I think to see kind of UiPath, this, ties up so many things of what you talked about a storyteller that people thought, I don't really understand him, is that English? And yet he actually told a brilliant story around robotic process automation, which is a industry in its infancy. So seeing that go from Bucharest into London, into New York, and he opened up, Japan, India offices sort of simultaneously, see sort of a enterprise decacorn in Europe like that. Yeah, it's echo everything. I mean, and I think we're seeing, as you said, across every stack, right? Kind of seeing kind of an explosion of the ability to innovate. And I look at like Stripe Treasury as not only the engineering stack, and they bring engineering into everything, but touching business processes where computer says no was the old rhetoric, right? And kind of breaking through that.
Absolutely. I've been tracking the audience questions, and there's a fair number of questions about geography. Kanu, I wondering maybe you could kick off sort of a thread about that, perhaps. So one of the threads on the audience questions has been around, investing outside the geographies that we're based. So a lot of the questions are around India. I don't know if anyone sort of, Kanu, maybe you want to kick it off. Do you guys have an opinion on India? Would you be investing in India? How do you think about investing in entrepreneurs that are remote?
Yeah. So for Coastal Ventures, geography has never been a bar. We have investments across the globe, including companies like companies like Rocket Labs, which effectively are building a pretty giant company in New Zealand. For us, it was usually the bar got higher the farther you are from Silicon Valley or just broadly North America. We do like to spend time on the ground and meet the founders and meet more of the team, understand what's top of mind of senior leadership, occasionally get a sense of how the workspace or a lab is set up, and especially there's a hardware component. We definitely want to understand the organization of the company, because it gives you a sense of how the key leadership think about the space. We also like to think about how, in what ways we can add value to a company, to a potential portfolio company, and it's helping them hire some key recruits is super important. So now with COVID, or this environment, meeting in person or visiting a workspace is equally hard, whether that startup is in Palo Alto or it's in India, and so or another continent. We think the diligence process has become a little bit more equal, if I may. We are also investors in companies such as GitLab that have proven that a fully remote team from the get-go can be widely successful. And so we're just increasingly believers that remote companies, remotely set up companies can be very successful. So we are just more open to continuing investing across the globe, including Asia.
Any advice or anything what would you say to we probably more than half the audience is physically in India. What advice would you have for those founders in terms of how to get your attention?
Oh, my email is on KV's website. Send me and we'll follow up. We respond to cold emails. Obviously, the node has to build the narrative of why is this a big vision? Why does this affect the GDP of India? And we'll absolutely chat.
Got it. Ashmeet, how do you think about geography, especially post-COVID?
I think the hegemony that Silicon Valley enjoyed for the last, decade and a half or so, I think is over. It's clear that we are going to have a global startup industry, global venture industry. Companies will be created in Europe, in India, in China. Obviously, we saw that over the last 2 decades. So that is clearly the trend. However, there are unfair advantages still that exist in Silicon Valley, and it has a long half-life. So slowly it will decay over time, the advantage that we have. And then the second thing I would say is, to an individual entrepreneur, geography is no longer a barrier. You now have to just think about, what do I want to create? What advantages can I accumulate? How do I build companies that gives me the ability to create, as Kanu so nicely says, something that will impact the GDP of India or the US or the GDP of the world. So it's no longer a barrier, but those unfair advantages will accrue. And then the last thing I'll say on geography is that as much as we are able to do over Zoom, as much as we are able to do things remotely, there is no substitute for an in-person meeting. And therefore, once COVID is over, once we are back to the ability to travel, we will see some reaggregation. But again, that will not overcome the long-term trend towards globalization of the startup industry.
Got it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it's inspiration to everyone who's not in the Valley, right? I do think we have such an opportunity set therefore presented to us. And I do think even in ourselves, the mindset shifting from that question of, oh, where are you based? Or where, to the market is what's the market you're going after? And for sure for us, if it's India to start with, and it's kind of specific element, especially on the B2C side, I think specific elements about the India market, I will throw my hands up and say I have no idea how to, even understand that and the nuances, and it's not helpful for me to be around your table and cap table. But if you're a SaaS enterprise, SaaS particularly company, absolutely, right? I'm going to look much more at the sort of business problem and sort of that TAM that you're addressing at a global level. And of course, you might start sort of whether it's geographically or vertically or whatnot, or size, but it really becomes a question about market much more than where you are.
Absolutely.
Specifically about India, it's sorry.
I was
just going to make an observation about India, because I watched the venture industry grow in India for a while. It's heartening to me to see that India, which started primarily on the tech side, started primarily as a services industry, then went through sort of the consumer revolution, which is where most of the media and press and coverage is about in the tech part of India today in startups. Is now I'm also beginning to see some number of true product companies, real technical innovation, deep technology, and I do see a small trickle of deal flow from there. And so that's very heartening, because now we are seeing the full breadth of opportunity exist in India. And so if you're an entrepreneur in India, there's certainly no limitation or barrier to you starting a company and making it a giant global success. That said, yes, there are advantages and disadvantages, for being in different places.
I think just to build on all of that, one of the things I have seen, especially in the last year, through a combination of the issues with COVID and frankly, the immigration challenges in the US with visas, is I think we're starting to see a lot of teams where from day one, you have one founder in the US and a founder in India. And I think, and mostly in the world of software, enterprise software companies, which is where I play, is what I've seen that activity a lot. The other thing I've seen is, given the huge investments that the large platform players, Microsoft and Google and others have made, what you have to, in India and in engineering and product teams in India, today you have product expertise in India. I mean, Ashmita and I both looked at investments in India a dozen years ago together. And at the time you could find lots of great engineers, but you couldn't find product managers. And it's that combination of product managers and engineers that leads to magical products. And I think the investments by some of the global companies in India have really changed that dimension. So I've seen some great product managers coming out of India in recent years. I do think the focus on what market you're playing in is critical. If you're building an enterprise software company coming out of India, I would strongly encourage you to come to the US market early for customers, because the market is much more demanding here. It's much larger. It's a much larger market, but it's also a demanding market. And so the product that you would build for a US market is very different from the product that you might end up building for the Indian market. And the sooner you make that transition, the better off you are. On the other hand, if you're building a consumer startup out of India, there's a very large consumer market there. And it's more likely than not, that product is unlikely to make a transition to the US market. There's just, consumer markets are less homogenous. There are exceptions to the rule, but for the large part, they're more local in nature. But we've talked a fair bit about the India question and the geography question. Would love to sort of continue the dialogue in terms of what are each one of us as investors most excited about? And we have very different lenses on investing. So, I'm hoping we'll have 4 very different answers here. But Kanu, maybe you could kick that off of saying, if you wanted to do it, what is that startup that you've been looking for that you haven't seen? Like, if you were to come across, you would say, I have been waiting for you for the last year. What does that startup look like?
There are a number of verticals or areas that I'm interested in, keen on, and diving deeper into. One attribute that I'm increasingly getting more excited to explore and to back companies in is where there's a very strong case to be made with a bottoms-up go-to-market. Increasingly, companies have have explored and proven with an open source, open core go-to-market, an API first solution, where you're building a groundswell and momentum to retire the traction, market share, and the defensibility risk. Some of the areas specifically where I get excited about this bottoms-up go-to-market or an API first solution are like around dev tools, this relatively newer category of ML ops, which is basically helping machine learning model lifecycle from training all the way to deploying in production, data enrichment solutions. So like those are the areas where there's a very clear case to be made on a bottoms up strategy. I think I'm getting increasingly excited about that. So that's one of the areas that I'd be very excited to spend more time in.
Got it. Reshma, now you do a startup every couple of weeks, investment, so you get to see more things than probably the rest of us put together. Curious, is there an area you would pick as I've been waiting for a startup in this zip code, or if I saw something that looked like blah, this would be a no-brainer for me?
And I do think if I have to pick my hill to die on, it's going to be the health tech hill. I think we are going to, 7 billion people, you can personalize literally head to toe, right? Because it's very personal. And so I just think like we've never seen an opportunity like this, and it's everything to play for. And I do think particularly just as London has had an advantage, with financial services being such a capital of the world, I also do just think we have an advantage with, again, Oxford and sort of obviously like one of the vaccines coming out of that. And so, advances there, DeepMind, again, with software kind of hitting health as such. So we're excited about a lot of the founder community coming out of all those places and what they're, what they're innovating on. And then future of work, is like, I also do agree that it is the era of the knowledge worker and enterprise. And so I think, actually, I think 2020 has been easier on that front, because we went from a binary world of everyone's in the building in an office to everyone's literally what we're doing today, right? Endlessly. And when we go into an optionality world starting in 2021, I'm petrified of what it's going to throw up, right? And especially kind of those human collaboration challenges, especially in that hybrid environment. So I do think the next few years we'll see a lot of issues, and also therefore a lot of founders tackling some of the challenges that come up. So those are two areas, very excited on.
Thank you for sharing that. Ashmeet, anything that comes to mind for you, sort of?
Well, Ashu, I'm not a thesis-driven investor, but I can certainly point to two trends which I think have intrigued me recently. The first is an extension of an observation that a lot of people have talked about, that data is the new oil, data is powering the new economy. Data is obviously what drives Facebook, Google, Twitter, et cetera, in the world, which I would extend to say that data is the new oil and data is the new asbestos. In other words, data is toxic, data causes cancer, and data is going to kill your company if you're not careful how you think about the data that your company has. And the most recent example is TikTok, which is obviously literally being threatened with death at this point, simply because they have what you think of as very innocuous data. I mean, teenagers sharing videos is pretty innocuous seeming data, but it's threatening enough when aggregated, and enough insights can be created that the US government felt threatened with the ownership of that data. So in general, data is the new asbestos. I have two companies in this space, Robust Intelligence and Concentric, both of which are attacking very different parts of that problem. And I do see a lot of opportunity over there. And then finally, as a tech nerd, speaking to people from IIT, someone who keeps a photo of Alan Turing on his coffee table or an IBM 029 on the other side of his shoulder, it would be remiss not to mention that Moore's law really, really has ended. Moore's law has been slowing down for a long time, and Professor Hennessy and Patterson gave their Turing Award lecture on the end of Moore's law, and it was incredibly insightful about what are the implications of that for what is today a 1.5 to almost $2 trillion industry. What are the implications of that over the next decade? And if anyone has not seen it, and if they're intrigued, I would recommend them to go and look up for that 1 hour Turing Award lecture by my professor, Professor Hennessy and Patterson, and sort of what the implications will be. And I think there will be literally 1,000 unicorns created because of those trends.
Yeah, no, I think both of those resonate very strongly for me. I love the way you phrased it. Data is the new asbestos. I definitely think dealing with PII the ability to manage PII data effectively is going to make or break many global companies. And if you do it well, there's a lot of value that you can extract. But we've seen huge mistakes in recent years. I mean, TikTok is the most recent one, but we look at what Equifax did and others. I think we'll see a lot of Enron-like situations because of mismanagement of PII, consumer PII. You know, for me, the one area that I've been fascinated by in recent months, and one that I think a lot of the trends that we've talked together are coming around together to disrupt, is the back office of every large company, whether it's ERP systems or supply chain or business analytics. Not so much the front end visual. There's been a lot of activity on the front office and the front end, but the back end infrastructure of large companies is still remarkably archaic. I mean, if you look at just supply chain, and in COVID, there's been so much talk over the last 6-9 months on supply chain. The last big success in supply chain was I2. And I was still graduating from college when that happened. And I'm a pretty old guy. So, it's a 90s company. There hasn't been real innovation in some of these core infrastructural elements. You look at financial systems, both Workday and NetSuite have taken it from on-prem to the cloud. But on-prem to the cloud is an innovation in how it's managed. They haven't really innovated on the core applications themselves. Most companies close the books every month. I mean, I come from a business family in India, and the one thing I was taught as a kid was you got to close the books every day. Daily accounts reconciliation was, the name of the game in a traditional business going back 30 years. And today, most large enterprises don't do that. And so I think bringing real-time systems and real-time decision-making into the guts of a large enterprise, I think is the next big hill from an enterprise productivity standpoint. Not so much, and so not to disagree with any of the things that people have said, but I look at every large enterprise and I think it needs to be reinvented in terms of its core infrastructure.
I think, Ashu, what you're doing is you are simultaneously highlighting, one, how large that opportunity is, given how long it has been since innovation occurred over there, and how difficult it is, how high the barrier is for someone to truly innovate and enter and disrupt a market like that. There's a reason why we are still running mainframes today. There's a reason that mainframes are still a growing market, not a shrinking market, in the era of cloud, in the era of distributed computing, et cetera. So look, I mean, I myself have a company working in that space, Auditoria, and a company which also happens to have an Indian founder who was in India when he started the company, and 2 US founders who started the company here. So one of those global startups that you saw working over there. But in that space, especially, what I would tell entrepreneurs is think very carefully about the tip of the spear. What is the entry point that you will have, which will allow you to enter a market where somebody installed SAP 20 years ago or I2 30 years ago, and they're going to actually change how they run that.
Yeah. No, I think, in fact, what you said, Ashmeet, is something that I find is a common theme for a lot of companies that are going after large platform-like opportunities. You have to find the point of entry that is narrow enough and precise enough that you can go deep and you can create a wedge. But at the same time, you have to, from day one, have to have the vision and the infrastructure to build a broad horizontal platform that will deal with the hundreds or maybe even thousands of use cases that an SAP or an Oracle system has to deal with day to day. I've been looking at the questions that have been coming in as we've been having this discussion. A lot of the questions are really around founders. So I want to go back to that topic if folks are okay. There have been quite a few questions about sort of how do we look for diversity in founders? And in fact, Reshma, if you don't mind my picking on you, one of the questions was directly for you. And the question was, you talked a little bit about focusing on the pedigree and the background and the education of founders, all attributes that give you signal.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there are many great founders from diverse backgrounds, and so the question was, how do you manage that? How do you sort of deal with the, how do you evaluate founders that don't necessarily have pedigreed backgrounds?
Yeah, and look, and I think again, only relevant to the problem you are going after. So, if it is a more deeply technical problem that you are solving, then I'm sorry, but yes, you need that. You need the background, right? If you're especially coming in from as a technical founder. But not all the companies we back are deeply technical. Some of them are very much a user experience to be fixed, interface experience, even as Connie said before, storytelling, messaging, all of that. And I think we absolutely back founders who don't have the founder market fit as we try to look for in some cases, and who just have a very different way of approaching a market. But I think my comment around sort of the pedigree definitely has to do with the more technical, the technical companies we back, where is based on a particular kind of thesis or working with a professor, PhD or whatnot. So, but given how many different kinds of companies we back, we absolutely all of these things again is like, here's a set of features about yourself, and you're not going to get 100 out of 100 for sure, but for what is relevant and matters, particularly for the opportunity you're going after, we want to see those characteristics really come out, and for us to sense a sense of excellence within that. So
makes a ton of sense. Anyone else in the group? Ashmeet, Kanu, this is a common problem for all of us. How do we think about diversity, given the sort of early stage of the nature of what we do? Would love for you guys to chip in on that.
I'll share the perspective of my mentor, Catherine, who was a very early woman venture capitalist here in Silicon Valley and faced enormous discrimination, including not being able to go to Caltech to study physics because they would not allow women when she went to school. And had to go to Canada just because she wanted to study physics, etc. And her response to this question always was, why does it matter to you as an individual, this question? It should not matter to you if you are an entrepreneur. You're not going to change your... Most of these things are invariants. And it is what it is. Just work with what you have. Look at what your strengths are, look at what your assets are, and see what gives you the special differentiation, unfair advantage to win, and work with that to succeed. Now, if you are a political scientist, if you are a lawyer, if you are a social scientist, if you are trying to create social change, that's a different question. Then, of course, we have to look at these issues. The problem of bias is real. The problem of discrimination is real. All of these issues are real. But to an individual who is trying to build a company and a startup and make that startup successful, mostly the answer to these questions doesn't matter. It is just an unfortunate reality that you have to deal with and solve.
I mean, I'll just give an example. So Hopin, actually, the founder of Hopin, is not some serial entrepreneur, not some pedigree, but what he had happened was 2 years before he started, he had a bad reaction for a medication he was taking, and he was literally locked into his house for 2 years with a condition. And that's why he built Hopin, because he was like, I miss going out. I miss going out to these tech events and getting to really collaborate with other entrepreneurs and so forth. And he built this whole environment. There you go. I mean, we didn't care where, we didn't care where he came from. Literally didn't even, 10 minutes into meeting him, we're like, that founder is just something, he's exceptional. Like, it stood out. And so as Ashmeet said, he did, whatever he had, he had that, the tip of the spear, the excellence, that we talked about even in sales, just for his own.
He converted his weakness into a strength, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
His limitation became the asset that allowed him to build such an amazing company. So as an individual, I think the question of how you look at it is very different from how someone may look at it from a macro perspective, who's looking at a social, political, legal landscape.
The only thing I'd add is, it really doesn't matter what your background is if you can cover it up with, being thoughtful about what others who have attempted building a company in this area have not gotten it right, and why that might be, and how will you retire those risks. And sometimes your early hires have to be the ones who can help retire that risk, or maybe you'll come up with a business insight or a new business model or a new way of aggregating data to get past a technical hurdle. But just being very, very thoughtful or sharing insights that, some of us have not already thought about, even though we've been investing in that area, giving us those insights can really impress, and that can make a change for us sometimes. It's like, have you thought deeply about this area, then you can retire a risk which somebody else in the past have failed, and why that would have been. And sometimes, like the combination of a business model or a business insight or a team or a technology, like figure out what combination of this, why will you overcome that challenge, and helping with just why that vision can still succeed is very important. And that's why I keep coming back to, like, being able to narrate what the big vision is, and then in what order you want to retire the risk. Like, that's really the name of the game as KV sees it, and that's the advice we give our portfolio companies too. Like, in this next interval of time, with this next pool of capital, what's the biggest risk you want to retire?
No, I think all well said. Well, I think we're now starting to wrap up. We're going to start the startup spotlight in a few minutes. So I wanted to give maybe everyone a minute to sort of, with a parting comment to the audience. If you had any thoughts or observations for the group, Ashmeet, if you want to start to wrap up, I'll give each person a minute. And then, thank you so much all for joining us today for this panel.
Thank you, Ashu. I'll repeat what I said earlier, that there is a confluence of circumstances, both at the macro level in terms of COVID and disruption in the world, and at the micro level in terms of where technology has headed, due to which this is an unusually good time to start a company. I love doing startups. If you're an engineer, if you've got an idea, you haven't even thought of starting a company, give me a call. I'd love to write you your first $1 million check. That's what I love to do. So give me a call.
Thank you. Kanu?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say we like to invest in early, bold, impactful opportunities. We can do something as tiny as a few $100K and incubate companies, and we've also done something as large as a single 50 million check into OpenAI. So this is a really large space for us to play. Our sweet spot is coming in at a seed or a Series A, which is typically like a 1 to 10 million as a first check at the company, and we make very concentrated bets. If we don't do too many seeds, we like to, over time, increase our ownership if possible. And so, please reach out to me if you are working on something interesting, which are like huge vision, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Reshma?
I'll end how I began. Europe is huge. It's it's an amazing opportunity. I will say it was interesting to come as a third-time immigrant, sort of, or second-time immigrant from US, to having born in India, grew up in US, and then moved to Europe to build a whole new career here. For Indians, it was really interesting 10 years ago. Not many of us sort of in this world of venture capital, certainly even in technology. And I would say, boy, what a decade of welcoming and openness in Europe. So I think don't ignore us. We are a massive continent, and so welcome all the IITians, Indians over to Europe, especially because that visa situation is very easy here and much easier in Finland and Portugal and places like that. So come over.
I just want to thank all of you. And, from my perspective, I've always believed that startups are the single biggest force for good in our society today. In a society where, we talk about a lot of societal problems, and, there's a lot of talk about inequality and others. And lots of problems exist: healthcare inequality, COVID, racism, bias. All of these issues are real. I truly believe that of the things that we could choose to do, I think the single biggest force for good is entrepreneurship and startups. And I want to thank all of you today for this opportunity. So thank you very much. Thanks, Ashmeet. Thanks, Reshma. Thanks, Kanu. And special thanks to Reshma, given what time of the day it is for you.
Thanks, everyone.
And so everyone, we're going to shut down this panel in a couple of minutes. You can sign back in for the spotlight. Animesh, any logistics instructions to the group that's going to dial back in for the spotlight?
Nothing major over here. To all of our attendees, on the main event website in the agenda, if you go on the startups tab, you will see spotlight number 1. We have We have panelists, mentors, about to give feedback to a good number of fellow entrepreneurs. Many of you asked the question about, I have an idea, how do I overcome this thing? What is your advice? You can come and get some feedback in the spotlight to see how it goes. Ashmeet, Kanu, and Reshma, thank you so much for your time. I fully expect lots of people to be emailing you for guidance, and thank you so much for your offer and your time.
Thanks, everyone.